Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad to be here with all of you tonight. Should be a great conversation. Got a number of things we can chat about. We're doing more and more live streams. We're just doing it every night we get on here and we have our conversations. So let's go. Let's go.
Century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, 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 everybody. So glad to be here with all of you. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. We are going to have yet another one of our great late night conversations. It's going to be awesome. The way this works, for those of you who may not be familiar, is I give my opening remarks. That's what I'm doing now. I just tell you what's on my mind, whatever it is I want to talk about. I give my opening remarks, and then from there, we have a roll call. And that's when I call you all out as I see you, names and locations, and people tell me who they are and where they're from, and that's all exciting, and we get to find out who's on the other side of the camera. And then the last half of the show, after the opening remarks and after the roll call, is me answering super chat questions for the rest of the night. So if there's something you would like me to speak about in the second half of the show, if there's a comment or a concern or something that's on your mind, send me a super chat. Send me a super chat. I don't know why I misspoke there. Send me a super chat, and I will discuss it in the second half of the show. I will do my best to move heaven and earth to give you an answer. There is a rare occurrence where someone asks something that I just have to ignore, but for the most part, if people ask me some kind of question, I will give them some kind of answer. That's how it works, and I'll be writing super chats down throughout the first half of our program. And then I'll start with that list in the second half of our show, and I'll just start answering questions. That is the way we do it. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell, and we are going to have an amazing super chat, an amazing super chat list tonight. Amazing list of questions for me to answer. I know you all have got a lot you want me to address. So I'm going to jump into my opening remarks for now. As I said, make sure you hit the like button. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. Make sure you hit the notifications bell. Let's do this. All right, everybody. My opening remarks tonight. The first thing I want to draw attention to, and I think we will have video a little later. We don't have video yet, but we will have video a little later, is my friend, Tara Reade, who is, an amazing, heroic, brave person. Tara Reade is in Russia, and she thought she was going there for a trip, but it looks like she is going to be staying there permanently. She had a press conference today and basically announced that Congressman Matt Gaetz told her not to come back. And it looked like the Biden administration was planning to go after her. And so because of that, she is now in exile, basically. Tara Reade was sexually assaulted, raped by Joe Biden when she worked for him. And now the situation for her has gotten to be so bad that Tara Reade is now in exile. She is staying in Russia permanently. And so, she gave a press conference this morning. Tara Reade will be trying to get Russian citizenship, apparently. This is a big development, right? That it really just shows you how much of a criminal government we have here in the United States, right? They're always talking about, the Russian government. They call it a gangster state, a mafia state. That's what we have right here in America. Right here in America, we have a government where, because Donald Trump is, considered an anti-establishment candidate, allegations against him that have no credibility go to trial, go to court, get all kinds of TV attention, etc. And because Joe Biden is the pick of the American political establishment, a very credible allegation against him that checks out, that is similar to what he did to a number of other women. It's a bit more extreme than the other cases, but it fits a pattern of behavior. A number of women came forward to say that Joe Biden, had engaged in this kind of behavior with them. A very credible story is not taken seriously, is ignored by the media. They have one argument against her, which is, oh, Russia, right? Because she takes anti-imperialist positions and is sympathetic to Russia. That we're just not supposed to believe anything she says. And then you just, the icing on the cake is, not only does the media not take her seriously, but she then has to flee the country. And she's now in exile. The USA is a mafia state, if there ever was one. The fact that Tara Reade is in exile, that is utterly, utterly shocking to me. I mean, it breaks my heart. And I think about Tara Reade and her family and what they're going through. And I mean, it's horrifying. It is just utterly horrifying what she's going through. Tara Reade is a really brave person who's dared to stand up to the most powerful man in the world. She can't come back to her home country. She doesn't speak Russian. Russian's not her language. She's not from there. She's never been there before, but now she's staying there for the rest of her life to avoid, what looks like, suppression from the American government. I guess, later, I think if the video footage downloads, we will watch her press conference. I don't want to put words in her mouth, and I don't want to misrepresent the details of her case, but you can go watch it on excuse me. You can go watch it on her YouTube channel. She gave a press conference today in Russia, and it looks like she is not coming back to the United States, and that is heavy. You can hear the details from her. It's pretty heavy. Let me see if I can find a shorter version of the video. I have the version of it that was on loop, and that's like 9 hours long, and I can't download all of that. So I'm just trying to find the shorter version of it. But yeah, I mean, it's heavy. It's very, very heavy. And, if the president of the United States, has sexually assaulted you, not only is your career over, and she talked about that with Tucker Carlson, but now, that ended her career in politics. She wanted to be a U.S. senator. She wanted, but after Joe Biden sexually assaulted her, she knew that she had no future in Washington, destroyed her career. And then on top of that, now, because she's spoken up and she's refused to back down, and because she takes anti-imperialist positions and is sympathetic to Russia and what they're facing around the world, now Tara Reade is in exile, and she is, trying to obtain Russian citizenship. She's living in Russia. That is unbelievable. That is really, really unbelievable. And, yeah, I can post the link. That's no problem. I can post the link right here. It's on Tara Reade's channel. Here you go. And yeah, I mean, it's just really, it's really, really shocking. I hope that if you're a religious person, you will say a prayer for her. That's my hope. I hope that if you are somebody who believed that the American government was somehow less corrupt or was more morally honest. I mean, this is absolutely Unbelievable. Tara Reade can't come home. Tara Reade has been kicked out of the country, fearing for her own safety, and she now has to live in Russia. That is really, really unbelievable. It's really, really unbelievable. And so there you have it. I just wanted to start out with that because there's just no, yeah, I mean, it is just really horrifying. There's just no way around this, and this should be all over the news. This should be all over the news. Could you imagine if Donald Trump, if a woman who had accused Donald Trump had to flee the country? Oh my goodness, CNN would be all over this. But women who accuse Donald Trump, they get to be celebrities on CNN, even when their claims don't add up. But Tara Reade, who has a very credible, very, very credible claim against Joe Biden, she has had to flee the country. It's pretty awful. It's very, very awful what they've done to Tara Reade, and I mean, that's all I can say about that. I don't want to get into any more specifics. At some point, I probably will be able to comment on, some specifics about this case. But right now would not be the appropriate time for me to do so. But, I mean, it's not anything I haven't said before, but in light of these events and the fact that Tara Reade has been kicked out of the country, there's some details that I've shared with you all before that are worth revisiting about, things that have gone on in the past year. But I'm not gonna do that at this time. I don't think that would be appropriate. But our heart goes out to Tara Reade. She has been suppressed, and now she's in exile, and this is a downer. So I'm gonna try to get myself in a happier mood. Every time I think about what they've done to her, I just get horrified and upset and angry. And I'll try to get myself in a better mood and have a more upbeat live stream with you all. Because you all, that's why we're here. We're here to be optimistic. We're here to focus on the future. We're here to focus on good things and the hope for the future. So I don't want to get too bogged down in that. But that news that came today, I mean, I heard about it a little earlier, but it is public now. That is really something else. So there you go. That's Tara Reade. So yeah, I guess I wanted to talk to you all tonight. About a couple different things. Because a lot of people look at what we're doing with the Center for Political Innovation, with the CPI, and they say it doesn't look like what other communist groups in America are doing, and they're right. And they look at what we are doing, and they say, Caleb, what qualifies you to say that you know better, that all the other communist groups are wrong and you're right? What qualifies you? What makes you think you have the right to say that? I look at what the Revolutionary Communist Party is doing. I look at what the Communist Party USA is doing. I look at what the Workers' World Party and the Party of Socialism and Liberation are doing. I look at what Socialist Alternative is doing and Socialist Action is doing. I see them different. I see them acting completely differently than you. I see them kind of trying to find peace with wokeness. I see them joining the anti-Trump hysteria. What makes you think that you know so much better? What makes you think that you are right and they are wrong, right? Most of the people in America who call themselves advocates of communism or Marxism act completely different than you, Caleb. So because of that, what makes them all wrong and you right? Well, there's a couple things. The first thing that makes them all wrong doesn't even necessarily make me right, but it makes them all wrong, is to look at the size and influence of these groups. They have absolutely No influence whatsoever. None of these organizations have a base among the population. None of these organizations have made any progress in the last 50 years. So if they were all doing the right thing and I was doing the wrong thing, why? They would all be achieving something and I would be left behind in the dust. However, it's the opposite of the case. Our organization's only been around a couple years. We've already been featured in Newsweek magazine. We've already been election monitors in Nicaragua. We've already, had big conferences that were debunked on news websites. We published books. We have the top-selling edition of Gaddafi's Green Book. The amount of shit that we've accomplished is massive for the size that we are. We're a small organization. We're not even a party. We're a think tank. And the amount of influence that we've had, one of our protests was mentioned in a speech by Nicolas Maduro. We are just marching ahead. We're all the communist groups are attacking us. The Communist Party that never even mentions other communist groups did a hit piece on us. Like, we are clearly marching ahead as an organization. We are having way more influence and an impact. We're sponsors of the biggest anti-war protest that's happened in Washington, D.C. in at least, 10 or 20 years. We were official sponsors of Rage Against the War Machine. Scott Ritter came to our reception at Rage Against the War Machine and spoke, and then he came and spoke at our conference. CPI, you watch that documentary that is linked below that Peter Coffin made about us and our work. And we're marching ahead as an organization. We are heads and shoulders above what the old communist groups are doing. So that's one argument that you could make. None of these communist groups have accomplished anything in 50 years. We've accomplished a lot in 2 or 3. So that's the first thing. But the other thing that I think qualifies us or me to act the way we do is that what we are doing is based on studying excessively the work of people who have done the kinds of things that we have done before. Right? You're going to go study biology. Would you start from scratch? Would you never look at Gregor Mendel? You'd never look at Charles Darwin. You would just start from scratch. Of course not. You're going to study biology. You'd study what all the other biologists had done before you set out to make new breakthroughs and new discoveries. Do you think that when the Wright brothers invented an airplane, they never looked at any other attempted flying machines? They just said, all right, we're not going to pay attention to any of these other people. We're not going to study hang gliders. We're not going to look at any other attempted flying devices, right? We are just going to do it all by ourselves. Do you think they did that? Of course not. When the Wright brothers invented the airplane, they spent a long time studying other flying devices and flying machines. They studied hang gliders. They studied other attempted flying machines, and they eventually cultivated the successful self-propelled flight, their first airplane, right? The Wright brothers finally developed an airplane that would work. Now, based on that, I'm telling you that what we are doing with the Center for Political Innovation is based on a series of other organizations. We have studied the history of the Communist Party. We have studied the history of the new communist movement of the 1970s, the history of the New Left, the history of the various communist groups that have existed in America. We've studied them. And based on that, we have come to the conclusion that one must operate this way. This is based on years of meticulous study and absorbing of information, learning where these groups succeeded and where they failed. That is what it's based on. It's not based on simply walking in the door and doing what we do. And it's also not based on a routine, because most of these communist groups are based on a routine. They do what their group has been doing for a long time. The Communist Party, they've been campaigning for Democrats, calling Republicans fascists. They've been doing that for a really long time. The Revolutionary Communist Party has been calling Republicans fascist and fundraising and promoting Bob Avakian as the great revolutionary leader. They've been doing that for a long time, right? The Workers' World Party, the Party of Socialism and Liberation, they've been staging anti-war protests in Washington, D.C. They've been doing that a really long time. They're in a routine. We are not in a routine. Lenin said that if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. You'll remember the Bolshevik Revolution happened because in a moment of crisis, Lenin returned from exile and he brought with him his famous April Theses and completely changed the tactics of the Bolsheviks in order to take power. They dramatically changed their tactics. What we are doing is we are reorienting and changing the tactics and the approach in the struggle to build a socialist society in the United States. We want a society where the banks and the factories and the major industries and the centers of economic power in America are organized to serve the people and not the profits of a wealthy few. We want to break the United States out of the system of monopoly capitalism. We want to break the United States free from this global imperialist monopolistic apparatus. We want to create an America for working families, an America that trades with the rest of the world on the basis of win-win cooperation, an America without unemployment, without poverty, an America with high-speed railway, an America with fusion energy research, an America where we're growing once again, and there's optimism and hope for tomorrow, an America where previously impoverished and oppressed communities are being lifted up, an America without prisons for profit, without wars for profit, without addiction and opioids for profit. That's what we want. A new America for working families. We want a society where the banks and the factories and the major industries and the centers of economic power are organized to serve public good and not the profits of a wealthy few. We want the means of production, the centers of economic power, to be controlled so that they continue to grow and have economic achievements and build a better tomorrow. That's what ultimately we are trying to do. We want to get beyond the irrationality of a system where people are homeless because there are too many houses, where people are hungry because there is too much food. We want to move toward a rational society where the economy grows, living standards advance and technology advances and all of society becomes wealthier. A society where creativity and innovation is rewarded. A society where we no longer have a wealthy few who gets rich by making everyone else poor. We no longer have poverty amid plenty. This is the socialist vision. Socialism is achieving a society where growth is no longer restrained, where innovation and creativity is rewarded. And the ultimate goal is to build a society and really a world with so much wealth and so much abundance that the need for the government itself can fade away. The state itself can fade away. There's no need for any government, where social hierarchies are abolished, where there's equality, a society with so much technological development that people only have to work because they feel like it. There's no longer a necessity for human labor. Labor becomes life's prime want and no longer a necessity, right? That is the ultimate vision, a world where there is so much wealth and so much abundance that inequality and all needs for social hierarchies and coercion can fade away. From each according to his own ability to each according to his needs. A society where people can just take what they need and do what they feel like doing. That is the ultimate goal. And we want to get there. And because we want to get there, we have to figure out what forces could be involved in building some kind of revolutionary movement. And in my recent book, Where is America Going?, I go into great detail about how we're entering a long-term capitalist crisis and how this long-term capitalist crisis, rooted in the problem of overproduction and the tendency of the falling rate of profit, the problem of capitalism, where it always creates more than the worker has the ability to buy back, where you get poverty amid plenty, the technological advancement that leads to mass unemployment and exacerbating the problem of the worker not being able to buy back what he produces. It's laying the basis for a big division within our ruling class. It's laying the basis for an escalated drive toward degrowth and grinding people into poverty and creating a low-wage police state, and for creating a new war around the world. And how the capitalist class is divided, more divided than it's ever before. Among the capitalists, there is a fight between the entrepreneurial capitalists who just want to make money and the lower-level capitalists who are basically trying to manage and stabilize the system. And that creates the basis for some kind of anti-monopoly coalition against the imperialists, against the big monopolists. That's what I've been talking about. But in this book, one thing that I do discuss that is definitely worth discussing is an event, is a period in American history that a lot of people don't know about. And it's called the New Communist Movement. The New Communist Movement of the 1970s. The last people who tried to do what CPI is doing right now were called the New Communist Movement of the 1970s. And there are a number of academic books that have been published on the New Communist Movement of the 1970s. This is one of them. It's called Revolution in the Air by Max Elbaum, right? 60s radicals turned to Lenin, Mao, and Che. Revolution in the Air by Max Elbaum. And there's another book. It's called Heavy Radicals, the FBI's Secret War on America's Maoists, the Revolutionary Union and the Revolutionary Communist Party, 1969 to 1990, by Aaron J. Leonard and Conrad A. Gallagher. This is also a very, very good book on the history of the New Communist Movement of the 1970s. And on top of that, there's Detroit, I Do Mind Dying by Dan Georgakis and Marvin Sirkin. This is also a very good book. This is about the new communist movement in Detroit, the Maoist communists in Detroit, and how they built up a lot of influence in local politics during the 1970s. This is a very good book that I would recommend as well. And in addition to that, you can actually go and read the documents of the new communist movement yourself on the Encyclopedia of Anti-Revisionism, which is a wing of the Marxist Internet Archive. The Encyclopedia of Anti-Revisionism online is a compilation of the actual writings, the actual pamphlets, the actual newspapers, the actual speeches of these groups. And you can read the arguments they had with each other back during the time that the new communist movement existed. The new communist movement is important because it was very much an out of the movement to the masses type of moment. It was a group of Americans who sought to build a new communist party that was inspired by the Chinese Revolution, that was inspired by the political upsurge of the 60s, but it understood that it was the broad masses of the American workers who could make such a revolution. So in order to understand the new communist movement, there's a number of things you have to understand. The first thing is that the American Communist Party was basically crushed by McCarthyism. During the 1950s, after the Second World War, the leaders of the Communist Party were thrown in jail. The living standards in the United States drastically increased. The American public and the labor movement wasn't interested in radicalism anymore. There was much more of a right-wing tone in the country. People felt like the living standards had shot up. The Great Depression was over. There was a wave of patriotism and fear of Russia. You had McCarthyism. And then, the Communist Party was kind of driven underground. You had McCarthyism. And then you had Khrushchev's secret speech that he gave condemning Stalin and claiming that all the allegations against Stalin of being a murderer were true. And many people quit the Communist Party. And after about 1957, 58, the Communist Party of the United States was very small and isolated. And it was basically, it was heavily infiltrated by the FBI. And it was basically just a vehicle. It was kind of a gesture to the Soviet Union. The USA had to have a communist party in order to show the Soviet Union that they were willing to negotiate. It was a diplomatic gesture to the Soviet Union when the Supreme Court re-legalized the Communist Party in 1957 with the Yates versus the United States ruling. The Communist Party came back into existence. Gus Hall was the leader. Almost all the leaders had been in prison and released on parole, and it was very managed and carefully controlled to make sure that it never really became a revolutionary organization. However, starting in the 1950s, you had the civil rights movement. There was a feeling among the ruling class of the United States that the oppression of African Americans was a ticking time bomb because the communists had been the main force protesting for Black people's rights around the country. Because of that, and because of the fact that in 1954, Emmett Till was lynched, and brutally murdered, and the image of his mutilated body was sent all over the world, and the Soviet Union and elsewhere was sending images of Emmett Till's mutilated corpse. Because of that, you had sections of the ruling class that were suddenly willing to challenge Jim Crow segregation. And you had the Kennedy family and wings of the Democratic Party, the northern wing of the Democratic Party, supporting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You had protests for civil rights. And you had a number of young Americans, many of whom had had parents who had been sympathetic to the Communist Party, had been around the Communist Party, who got involved in the protests supporting the civil rights movement. And then, as McCarthyism was ending, there was kind of a blowback against McCarthyism among the population. There was a feeling that McCarthyism helped the communists, that McCarthyism had created an atmosphere where alienated people became sympathetic to communism, that McCarthyism had created an atmosphere where the population was so threatened and so rigidly controlled that people would become alienated from U.S. society. There was kind of a blowback against McCarthyism. What they call Cold War liberalism started to emerge. Eisenhower was the president, and he was a very, very liberal Republican. You started to have television programs like The Twilight Zone that were demonizing hard right-wingers and extremists, right? Was equating fascism with communism. Was arguing that the greatness of America was we were neither fascist nor communist, and we weren't totalitarian. We advocated free thought. And you started to have, the Twilight Zone, the Manchurian Candidate, TV programs like this that equate the far right with the far left, that have a kind of liberal anti-totalitarian message. And that was the beginning of what you can call the new left. You had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was a group of activists who protested for civil rights, got involved in a lot of civil disobedience, etc. And then you had an organization called Students for a Democratic Society. If anyone's ever heard of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. This was a group that was funded by the United Auto Workers Union. And it was a group of college campus liberal activists that were pacifists, that were, advocates of civil rights for African Americans, but also very against communism, very anti-communist. Students for a Democratic Society. And Students for a Democratic Society was kind of the big liberal, left-wing, pro-civil rights activist group that emerged on the college campuses. And it was being funded by a major labor union, the United Auto Workers. And it was basically a pushback against McCarthyism. McCarthyism had gotten so out of hand, and you had a big right wing at the time, the John Birch Society, and right wing, hard right wing fanatics that were tied in with the military industrial complex. Well, Students for a Democratic Society and the civil rights movement was kind of a pushback against that by the liberal establishment. At the same time, you had the CIA, they were funding Partisan Review magazine, all the big, CIA, foundations, linked foundations, the Ford foundations, the Rockefeller think tanks. They were all funding something called the Institute for Policy Studies that was, giving grants to left-wing professors to write articles criticizing American foreign policy. And you had from the top, from the highest levels of the American government, from the United Auto Workers, from the CIA, from the Ford Foundation, you had a pushback against McCarthyism, because McCarthyism had been kind of a mobilization. It had taken on an anti-establishment character. It was pushing the United States to operate in ways that were not strategic and in the interest of American imperialism. So you had a pushback against McCarthyism from the highest levels of U.S. society, and you had many young activists. You had many young activists who emerged. And they were involved in Students for a Democratic Society. When the Vietnam War got going, many young people that were pacifist in their orientation or were anti-militarist or had supported the civil rights movement were opposed to the Vietnam War, were burning their draft cards. And after as the early 60s got going, many in the civil rights movement were getting very radical. You had Robert F. Williams. Robert F. Williams was a Black man, a leader of the NAACP in Monroe, North Carolina. And he had been a leader of the NAACP, and he had been protesting in North Carolina for the right of Black people to swim in the public swimming pool. He said, if our tax money is paying for this swimming pool, we ought to be able to swim in it. And they had protests at the swimming pool demanding the right of Black people to swim at the same swimming pool. Well, the Ku Klux Klan didn't like it, and it started shooting at them. So they started their own chapter of the National Rifle Association, the NRA, and they started shooting back. And so there was, this armed wing of the NAACP. Eventually, Robert F. Williams had to flee the United States. He moved to Cuba. He spent some time in China with Mao, and he ended up putting out, a lot of radio broadcasts from Cuba urging Black people to revolt against the American government. He wrote a book called Negroes with Guns that was widely circulated, advocating that the civil rights movement take up armed self-defense. And from Cuba, he began broadcasting revolutionary broadcasts. And you had a number of young African Americans who were involved in the Students Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and other groups coming together and saying, we need a new Communist Party. They understood that the regular Communist Party was reformist and not revolutionary, but they liked Robert F. Williams. They liked Mao in China. They liked Fidel Castro in Cuba. So they formed a group called the Revolutionary Action Movement, the RAM, it was called. RAM, Revolutionary Action Movement. And the Revolutionary Action Movement was a kind of secretive, clandestine, Black revolutionary communist organization that was formed in 1962, I believe, the RAM. And the RAM, there were many Black revolutionaries who were attracted to it. At one point, some of them were framed up, accused of trying to bomb something or blow something up, but they were acquitted. The charges against them were dropped because it was a frame up. And, this happened. This was an organization. Malcolm X met with the RAM, the Revolutionary Action Movement, and the activists. He met with them. He never, I don't think he joined them, but he met with them and he expressed sympathy with them before he was killed. And RAM was kind of this new development of Black revolutionary activists. Now, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, who eventually started the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, were in the RAM organization, and they kind of broke away and decided to do the Black Panthers as their own thing. And that's where the Black Panther Party came from. And the Black Panther Party became kind of the symbol of the radical, revolutionary, communist wing of the Black liberation civil rights movement. The Black Panthers wore uniforms. They looked like, third world revolutionaries from Africa or from the Middle East or something like that. And they were kind of the symbols of the Black liberation movement. And they carried, Mao's little red book. And they were kind of the very attractive symbol of Black revolution. And they existed, the Black Panthers, and they were a huge development, and many in the Black community looked up to them as great heroes, etc. And then on the college campuses, the protests against the Vietnam War got bigger and bigger and bigger. Columbia University was shut down in 1968. Students occupied buildings and seized control of buildings and refused to leave, and the police were called in to drag them out of buildings and beat them up. And Columbia University, this Ivy League school in Harlem in the United States, was shut down by a student uprising. And, the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, the organization that led the uprising, was dominated by different communist factions. The leader of the uprising at Columbia University was a guy named Mark Rudd. And he called himself a communist, etc. You had other places. 1968, the Democratic National Convention that was held in Chicago. You had huge protests against it by young people who waved the flag of the Vietnamese National Liberation Front and chanted, "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is going to win," and battled with the police in the streets of Chicago. That was a very big development that happened at the Democratic National Convention in 1968. You had a big march to the Pentagon that happened in 1967, where thousands of young radicals, including a lot of hippies and others, were fighting with the police and fighting with the military, trying to get into the Pentagon, etc. All of this happened, and Students for a Democratic Society, which was a very loose association, anyone could be a member of Students for a Democratic Society. This very loose organization called Students for a Democratic Society was kind of the main white campus activist group, and the Black Panthers were the main African-American group. And there were other organizations that existed, but the two big organizations were the Black Panthers and Students for a Democratic Society. Now, Students for a Democratic Society, at its 1969 convention, was divided into two factions. One faction was called the Workers' Student Alliance, and it was led by the Progressive Labor Party, PLP, which was a Maoist communist group. And they argued that the Black Panthers, because they preached racial separatism, that they were no good, they were black fascists or whatever. They also thought the Vietnamese National Liberation Front were sellouts because they negotiated with the United States, and etc. So the Progressive Labor Party, they basically took the position they didn't support the Vietnamese, they didn't support the Black Panthers. So the group within SDS that opposed the Progressive Labor Party was called the Revolutionary Youth Movement, or RIM. In RIM, they wrote a manifesto describing themselves, which was called "You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows." It was a manifesto. It was led by Bill Ayers, Bernardine Dohrn, and others. And they took the position, that that they did support the Black Panthers and they did support the Vietnamese, and that it was time to build a new communist party among white American youth to get them to support the Black Panthers and support the Vietnamese to fight against imperialism. And those were the two factions. And basically, the two groups fought it out. There was a lot of, scuffling and fighting between them. And there was a lot of fighting between the two groups. And as a result of the fighting between the two groups, Students for a Democratic Society split. With the Workers' Student Alliance group, Progressive Labor Party, on the breaking away and forming its group, and the Revolutionary Youth group, the Revolutionary Youth Movement, or the Weathermen, or the Weather People, as people called them, forming another group. Now, the Weather People, or the Weathermen, as they were called, they decided that the counterculture, the hippies, were who they wanted to base themselves among. And they argued that drug use and that street fighting and left adventurism, that was the answer. And they promoted rock and roll music. They promoted the hippie counterculture, and they argued that since the counterculture was very popular at the time, that the counterculture could be used, the hippies could be used as like a base of mobilizing young white Americans to support the Black Panthers. And they took the position that most of the white American working class were quote unquote pigs. Most of the white American working class were supporters of imperialism who benefited from imperialism. So they had no revolutionary potential. And that was their position. However, there were many people within the revolutionary youth movement who didn't agree with that. As the Weathermen became more adventurous, they called an action called the Days of Rage. That was just basically they got baseball bats and helmets and attacked downtown Chicago with 300 people. They started doing very, very ultra left, street left adventurist, extreme activities. You had a faction in the revolutionary youth movement that rejected what the Weathermen were doing. Right? And they were called the Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, RIM 2 is what they were called. And it was led by, you had Bob Avakian from the Bay Area, the leader of the Revolutionary Union in the Bay Area. You had a guy named Mike Klonsky, whose father had been a prominent leader of the Communist Party USA, and he was very pro-China. You had Jerry Tung, who was an Asian American who lived in New York City, had been part of the Progressive Labor Party. You had a number of different people. Nelson Peary, was a very popular African American leader. He'd been the head of the California Communist League. There were a number of different groups that were formed. There's a guy named Michael Lasky, who had been a Maoist, a longtime Maoist. You had a lot of different people. During this time that were supporting the Vietnamese, supporting the Black Panthers, and sympathetic to China, but also wanted to go to the American working class, wanted to build a revolutionary organization among the American working class. You had a lot of different groups and people, and Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, RIM 2, was kind of the basis, I guess, the association, the grouping of people that took those positions but did not embrace the left adventurous street fighting of the Weathermen. Now, history tells us, we know what happened with the Weather Underground. They became a bombing organization. They went on a series of, bombings. They went underground. They launched, terrorist attacks and bombings, etc. But many of the people who didn't join the Weather Underground or the Weathermen and became Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, they're the ones that laid the basis for what we call the new communist movement. They came out of the new left, and they took the position that they supported the Vietnamese people in their fight against U.S. imperialism. They supported the Black Panthers in their effort to organize Black people as in a revolutionary movement that was anti-imperialist and fighting for their rights. But they wanted to go to the broad masses of people, and they rejected the counterculture. And that's a really big aspect of it. The Weathermen and the SDS were largely hippies that were counterculture, long hair and sex and drugs and all of that. But the new communist movement, they cut their hair short. They didn't engage in sexual promiscuity. They didn't use drugs. And they had kind of an out of the movement to the masses understanding. They denounced the hippie counterculture as bourgeois, and they were inspired by China, which was at that point having the Cultural Revolution. And, Mao's Little Red Book was being studied everywhere. And they tried to form a new communist party that would be aligned with China. That was what the new communist movement was. And almost immediately, it broke up into many different factions. The Revolutionary Union from the Bay Area, which eventually became the Revolutionary Communist Party, that was one faction. There was the October League existed. That was led by Mike Klonsky. It eventually became the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist. You had the Communist Workers' Party that was led by Jerry Tung. You had the Communist Labor Party that was led by Nelson Peary that had a lot of African-American members. You had a number of these different factions. There was a feminist grouping. There was a woman named Marlene Dixon who led what was called the Democratic Workers' Party, the DWP, and she formed that out in California. And she was a Maoist communist, and she had the Democratic Workers' Party. And there were a number of different groups. There was the Communist Party USA Marxist-Leninist that was led by Michael Lasky. And there were a number of these different organizations that were formed that were trying to form a new communist party. And their members generally got jobs in factories, despite having degrees. They had, degrees from Harvard and Yale. These are, kind of privileged middle class, upper middle class people who were very interested in communism. But they got jobs in factories, and they tried to spread communism to the working class. And they were doing the right thing. They had the right orientation. They didn't support the new left. They didn't support the counterculture. They knew that the new left was a deviation, and they saw the broad masses of the American workers as the target audience that they were aiming to recruit. The new communist movement is worth studying because that was an attempt to get to the masses of people. It was an attempt to build a communist party among the broad masses of Americans. The problem was that at the time, the U.S. economy was still very strong, and most U.S. workers had such a high standard of living that they were not interested in communism. They were not interested in a revolutionary working class movement, and that the hippie counterculture was seen as kind of a middle class thing, and white American workers generally were conservative, and they thought that the hippies all needed to get their hair cut and go get a job, etc. Right? There was hostility toward the hippie counterculture and towards the left. And so these people that worked with them in factories and were trying to win them to communism were perceived as being allies of the hippies, allies of the counterculture, and they were not well received. And the new communist movement, the NCM, was basically, it was an attempt to bring communism to the broad masses of Americans. However, China as a country was changing at the time. China's foreign policy was shifting. China had been betrayed by the Soviet Union, and China was presenting itself as an ultra-revolutionary country, right? It was ultra-revolutionary. The Soviet Union, they said, was revisionist and was selling out and was aligning with the U.S. imperialists. They were a revolutionary country. But increasingly, China was aligning with the United States in the name of fighting the Soviet Union. They said the Soviet Union was the main danger to the people of the world. They started aligning with the United States in the name of fighting the Soviet Union. So China's politics were shifting. Eventually, Mao died. You had Deng Xiaoping, who came to power. And on top of that, the world was changing, right? And you had the rise of Euro-communism in Western Europe. In 1978, a number of communist parties in Western Europe cut ties with the Soviet Union. So it was a difficult time to do what these people did. But if you read these three different books, right, that I just held up, right, you'll see the successes that these people had. Revolution in the Air by Max Ellbaum, Heavy Radicals, FBI's War on American Maoists, and Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. Detroit is probably where they were the most successful. There was a Maoist communist judge elected in Detroit at one point. There were a number of very influential labor leaders in Detroit that were Maoist communists. You had Kenneth Cockrell, who was a very famous lawyer in Detroit, who was a Maoist communist, ran the South End Press, and led the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, a faction of black auto workers that was communist oriented. And I go over all of this in my new book. In chapter 4 of my new book, I talk about the new communist movement of the 1970s because it was a genuine attempt to go out of the movement to the masses. However, it was not successful because the conditions in the United States were still economically quite prosperous. And then you had a big economic downturn in 1978, but the response of most American workers was to become more conservative and to become more ultra-patriotic and militaristic. You had the rise of Ronald Reagan. So as a result of that, in about 1981, 82, you had what they call the Great Retreat. And it's basically when all these communist groups decided you can't organize the masses. You can't organize, the bulk of the American people. Most Americans are anti-communist. They're not ready for it. And you saw just this great retreat that happened, and instead, the communists, they went and supported the Democrats. They went and got jobs with the labor union bureaucracy. They worked in academia. Communists stopped trying to build a mass communist party among the masses of the American workers because they felt it couldn't be done. They felt the fact that they had spent 10 years working in factories trying to win their coworkers to communism and not seen very much success. And then on top of that, the rise of Ronald Reagan, they felt like at that point that showed that it couldn't be done. Right. And the new communist movement of the 1970s is important. And one of the things I've really emphasized is this incident called the Boston Trap, that I refer to as the Boston Trap, which is that in 1974 there were racist riots in Boston against busing, and I talk about this in my book. Right there's a page where I have a whole section on the Boston Trap. Right on page 301 of my new book, I talk about the Boston Trap. Right, the Boston Trap, and how, there were these racist riots in Boston against school integration, against school busing. And these racist riots were pretty awful. And some of the communist groups made the mistake of supporting them. And they made the mistake of supporting them on the grounds that it was working class people who were involved, on the grounds that, they didn't want to be going with the mainstream of the left. However, these were clearly racist riots. I mean, the black nationalists were opposing school busing. The Black Panthers wanted black schools for black children, etc. And so you had a number of communist groups that, because the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam were opposing school busing, and because these were working class people that were rioting against busing, they took the mistaken position of supporting the racist anti-busing riots. And that was a huge mistake. However, afterwards, there was such castigation of them for doing this that the memo got sent out that you never support anyone who's labeled right wing, right? If someone's right wing, you never support the right wing. And that is the Boston Trap. It's this understanding that what they call the right wing, whatever that means, is the enemy. And so it's a huge, unforgivable mistake to ever support anything labeled right wing. And that's the Boston Trap. Because right now, being anti-war is labeled right wing. Right now, being against the vaccine mandates or questioning big pharma is labeled right wing. They label everything that goes against, opposing weapons to Ukraine is labeled right wing. They label everything that's anti-establishment right wing right now. Right? But there's this memo that's been sent out among the various communist groups: never support anything that's labeled right wing. They've gotten into the Boston Trap, where it's like, oh, if you support the working class people, you're supporting racists. That is the mindset that a lot of these communist groups have. Well, it's outdated. It was true. It was wrong to support the Boston racist riots in 1974, but Trump supporters are not, racist rioters in Boston. That's just not what they are. And there's many examples of this that I talk about in the book. And that the new communist movement, if you read about the activities, and especially 1978, 79, 1980, where things really escalated, the new communist movement got desperate, and these groups were very heavily infiltrated by the government. And that's very clear. The Revolutionary Communist Party was infiltrated. The October League was infiltrated. The Workers' World Party was infiltrated. And they were being used. They were kind of chess pieces in a bigger game. The American elite were fighting against each other. Ronald Reagan and his faction that was tied in with the military-industrial complex was fighting against Jimmy Carter and Paul Volcker and his faction that was tied in with the Rockefellers and the Trilateral Commission. And there was a battle among the American elite. And these groups were all kind of pawns in that battle that was taking place. And that's important to understand. For example, the Carter administration went after the government of South Korea. The government of South Korea, the military dictator Park Chung-hee, very authoritarian military leader in South Korea, but he was independent of the United States. He wanted South Korea to get their own nuclear weapons. So the Carter administration went after Park Chung-hee. And there was a whole Koreagate investigation in the United States, going after various congressmen, various people who had ties to the government of South Korea. Ronald Reagan was much more sympathetic to the government of South Korea, but the Carter administration was out to destroy the government of South Korea. And these kind of divisions were building up within the ruling class. In Italy, this is very famous. It was revealed that a number of Italian members of parliament and elected officials were involved in a Masonic lodge that was being directed by the CIA to carry out CIA operations and funnel money. And it sounds like something out of a crazy conspiracy theory or a sci-fi movie. But read about P2 Lodge, right? Very famous incident, Propaganda Do, or the P2 Lodge It's a really big deal. When that was revealed in 1978 or 1979, that this secret society directed by the CIA had been manipulating Italy's politics and was involved in all kinds of illegal activities. Go and read the Wikipedia page for Propaganda Do. This is all admitted, right? Propaganda Do, the P2 Masonic Lodge in Italy that was run by the CIA. This was happening. And part of Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor to Jimmy Carter, part of his strategy was manipulating the global communist movement, right? You have to remember Pol Pot, was a leader, a communist leader who was backed by the United States to fight against Vietnam. And China invaded Vietnam to support Pol Pot. And you had communist groups killing other communist groups. There was a lot of confusion going on in this period. There was an intentional effort on the part of American intelligence to manipulate and confuse these various communist groups and get them fighting each other, get them working for one faction against another. It was a very difficult time. What those folks did in the new communist movement was very difficult. And there were thousands and thousands of different people. I mean, we're talking 20,000, 30,000 people that were in these different communist groups, maybe even 100,000. People that were in these different communist groups during this time, and they were arrested by the government. They were suppressed. It was a strange period in American history, and ultimately the conclusion of it was that Great Retreat, where they all kind of went back into kind of hiding, became puppets of the Democrats. The Great Retreat that I talk about. However, there's a lot we can learn from that period, because what we're doing now with the Center for Political Innovation is we are repudiating the Boston trap. We're saying that no, this idea that if you support anything labeled right wing, that's a crime. No. And that being anti-war, going to rage against the war machine, that's okay to do. We're repudiating the Boston trap. And on top of that, in addition to repudiating the Boston trap, we're doing something else, which is that we are repudiating the Great Retreat. And we're saying that average Americans can be approached about communist ideas. We can go out of the movement to the masses, and that we need to reject the so-called left and get to the masses, which is really what the new communist movement was all about. They rejected the Weathermen and they rejected the hippies, and they went to the masses. They got jobs in factories. They recognized that the broad masses of Americans, the American working class, those were the people that would be the basis of bringing socialism to the United States. And that's something very important to learn from the new communist movement. They had the right instincts, but the conditions, the ground wasn't fertile. They had good seeds to plant, but the ground was not fertile. But now the ground is fertile, but we don't have good seeds anymore. The communist movement, because of the failures of the 1970s and because of all the confusion since then in the 80s and the 90s, now the communist movement has lost its way. But we need to get seeds once again, because the ground is now fertile. Average Americans are open to learning about Marxism and communism. Average Americans are opposed to these wars. Average Americans understand that the government is run by a group of rich people who don't care about them. Average Americans have that understanding. However, the communist groups have all deteriorated into foot soldiers of the elite. They've developed an anti-populist mindset. They view average Americans as the enemy. They have the wrong understanding. So the Center for Political Innovation is trying to reforge a fertile seed to go to the masses. That is what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to restart the work that was left behind after the failure of the new communist movement of the 1970s. That's what we were trying to do, right? We're trying to get out of the movement to the masses, and we're trying to cultivate a socialism with American characteristics, to lay the basis for building an anti-imperialist, progressive working class movement in America. And in my book, Where is America Going?, I talk about that at great length. And that is what I'm trying to get at. And that's why studying the history of the new communist movement is important. Learning what these groups did wrong and right, and what can be applied, what can we learn from back then, and what can we not learn from, right? I mean, it was a different time. There was no internet back then, for example. Right? There was no internet back then. There were no computers. There was no, it was a different time technologically. It was a different time in world history. Communism was a huge movement at that point with China and the USSR. And, they say 1978 was the height of global communism. So it was a different time, different conditions, different circumstances, different political ideas floating around. But there's a lot you can learn from it. And in this book, Where is America Going?, a big part of the book of chapter 4 and of one of the appendices is kind of learning from this particular period and how the fight in the ruling class led to these groups being manipulated. That's what I'm talking about. And I'm telling you all of this here on these streams because I know you all take this seriously. I take this seriously and you take this seriously. And I do get repetitive on here. We do talk about these similar topics over and over again. But I'm trying to reiterate to you all why this stuff is important. And so that's why we're talking about it on here. And I guess that's how I wanted to, conclude my opening remarks for tonight. I only have one super chat so far. So if people want to keep the super chats rolling in and give me something to talk about in the second half of the show, that'd be great. I'm going to put on some music right now. I love American folk music. American folk music is a big part of what it means to be a communist. Communist groups, and folk music and, Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger. And it's all a big part of what it means to be an American communist. And probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite, one of my most favorite songs is an American folk song called "Michael Row the Boat Ashore," right? It is one of my absolute favorite folk songs. Apparently, it was an African American spiritual that was kind of lost during the Civil War. There was the Union Army went to an area in the South and it liberated a group of slaves who were on an island, and it heard them singing this song. And then it was just it was put into an old song book in the 1800s, and it was just kind of forgotten. But then Pete Seeger, the folk singer, rediscovered it when going through an old song book, and he popularized it in the 1950s. And when I was a kid, I used to go to, to folk music concerts. Every concert I went to, they would sing "Michael Row the Boat Ashore." It's one of my most favorite songs ever. It's an African-American spiritual that was kind of lost. It was around at the time of the Civil War. And it was just kind of lost. And then Pete Seeger found it in the back of an old song book from the 1800s, and he made it popular again in the 50s. It's a really great song. There's just something beautiful about it. I mean, obviously, it is a religious song. It is referencing going to heaven, right? It's about crossing Jordan's River, which is an analogy people use for going to heaven when you die. But it's a very beautiful song that really just kind of catches the beauty of American folk music. So I'm going to put on "Michael Row the Boat Ashore." And then after that, we'll do the roll call. But folks, if you have something you want me to talk about in the second half of our show, please send me a super chat because right now I only have one super chat to answer. So it's going to be a short second half. So there we go. "Michael Row the Boat Ashore."
Hey, you guys got to go on the chorus now. I got to hear you on the chorus. I'll do the verses. And if you know the verses, you can do it too. Michael row the boat ashore. Hallelujah. Michael row the boat ashore. Hallelujah. Sister, help to trim the sails. Hallelujah. Sister, help to trim the sails. Hallelujah. Michael row the boat ashore. Hallelujah. Michael row the boat ashore. Hallelujah. The river Jordan is chilly and cold. Chills the body but not the soul. Hallelujah. Michael row the boat ashore. Hallelujah. Michael row the boat ashore. Hallelujah. The river is deep and the river is wide. Hallelujah. Milk and honey on the other side. Hallelujah. Come on, Bob. Michael row the boat ashore. Hallelujah. Michael row the boat ashore. Hallelujah. One more time. Michael row the boat ashore.
Yeah, it's just a great American song. It's just one of those great American folk songs. Oh, my grandfather died fighting in the Korean War. What approach should be used when discussing Korea with my neocon family? Also, fantastic choice of music. Well, thank you. I'm glad you like it. Grandfather died fighting war. What approach should be used when family? Very good question. Very good. And there's another one here. Was Marcus Garvey a city builder? That's a good question as well. So there we go. All right. Well, names and locations, folks. I will call you all out as I see you. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us? Names and locations. And I will just start calling people out as I see them. Let's find out who's on the other side of the camera. We got Scott in Pennsylvania, Rice from Adelaide, Australia, Christian in the House of Sick Children. I hope they get better soon, Christian. I'm so sorry to hear that. Lawrence Johnson in Chicago, Scott in Pennsylvania, Killian in Milwaukee, Michael in Houston, John McCarthy in Chicago, JT24 in Mississippi, Stephen Ann in Georgia, Stephen in Boston, Maddie in California, Colin in Greensboro, Kitty in Chattanooga, Balthazar in Oakland, Zachary Brunch in Richmond, Virginia. Welcome. We got Ron McKinnon in New York City, Temple City, California. Very, very good. So glad to have you. Jamie in St. Paul, Zach in Seattle, Alex from Brazil, Detroit, Michigan, Anthony, Herb Bryant in Florida, St. David's, Bermuda, Sophia in Virginia. Welcome, Sophia. Heidi in Edinburgh. Welcome. Sophia, by the way, is very big in Chinese social media. She is huge in Chinese social media. I've been honored to do a few interviews with her and the great work that she does. Shout out to Seattle, says public domain. Grass Valley, California, Molly McGuire in Orange County, A Better America in Michigan. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. We got Bob Troy in New York, Ryan in Kansas City. We got Fremont, California, Jenny Boris. We got Mariah in North Carolina saying happy Tuesday. Bob Troy in New York. Welcome, everybody. Names and locations. We are doing the roll call. Just finding out who is watching. It's always good. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. It is always good to find out who is on the other side of the camera, who is watching, because there is plenty of people. This is a great community that we have here. Now, I do want to, as we wait for more names to come in, I do want to remind people, and we got a list of a few super chats already. I do want to remind people that if you're watching this right now, you are one of the lucky people. We got David Fox in Bendigo, Australia. You're one of the lucky few who is watching this live. Most people watch this show the next day. They watch this show the next day, later in the week, etc. But you're watching it live, and that gives you the special ability to craft the conversation however you want. You can push the conversation one way or another way. You can make the conversation go however you want it to go. And so I encourage you to use that ability. We got Keith Preston of Attack the System, Richmond, Virginia. Would you do a video on Trotskyism? I have done many videos on Trotskyism, especially the Saxton lectures. I would encourage you to send a super chat so that you can craft the conversation here as you want it. I will talk about what you super chat me, and you who are watching live have the special privilege, the special ability to nudge this conversation one way or another way to make it go however you want. Get me talking about whatever you want me to talk about. Patch in Arizona. Send me a super chat. Get me talking about your favorite topic. That is your ability. As one of the live audience members, you have the ability to nudge this conversation however you want. Nina in Kansas City is with us. Very, very good. So that's what I would encourage you to do. Send a super chat and get us talking about whatever it is you want to talk about. So I'm going to start answering the super chat questions that people have, but keep them rolling in. I mean, it's the night is young, as they say. It's, we still got 45 minutes to midnight, and I can keep going as long as I need to. I want to answer your questions. That's why we're here. So the first super chat question I have is, McCarthyism suppressed communism. This is from Christian in New Jersey, and it was replaced by the New Left movement, which is very academic, which is what Americans think communism is. Yes. Well, I mean, for a long time among the McCarthyists and Republicans, they have considered anything that the Democrats do to be communism. That has been the argument, right? Is that the Democrats are commies, they're soft on communism, etc. And so because of that, many people are under the impression that anything that is promoted by the Democratic Party is communism. And that is simply not the case, especially now. A lot of what the Democratic Party promotes, for one, degrowth. Degrowth is not communist at all. Look at China. Under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, they have grown astronomically and raised so many people out of poverty. They have built the world's largest hydroelectrical power plant, the Three Gorges Dam, which is an amazing facility in China, just a huge hydroelectrical facility. They're making huge advances in fusion energy. They don't believe in degrowth in China. But yet, if you go to Barnes & Noble, all the books criticizing capitalism say capitalism is bad because of growth, which is not what Karl Marx said. In fact, Marx, his whole critique of capitalism was that capitalism holds back growth because of the problem of the tendency of the falling rate of profit and the problem of overproduction, poverty amid plenty, poverty created by abundance. Capitalism creates a situation where self-driving cars would be an economic disaster. Capitalism creates a situation where growth is restricted. The answer is yes, and I will get to that. And very good question. Very good question. Very, very good question, Molly McGuire. I think that's a great question. So there you go. I mean, when the Democratic Party opposes growth, they're just clearly not promoting communism. When the Democratic Party promotes foreign wars and interventions, communists historically have been the people protesting against the wars and demanding an end to imperialism, supporting the Vietnamese people in their struggle for national liberation. When the Democrats promote hysteria about, oh, someone's tied to Russia, well, that's what McCarthyism is. The Democrats at this point are the more pro-imperialist party. The Republicans are tied to the lower levels of capital that does not appreciate their degrowth policies. There's a divide in the ruling class. And that the New Left was a recreation. Oh, we got Jonathan Mahari in Stockholm, Sweden. The New Left, and thank you, Small Town Voice. You don't have a question, but the super chat is appreciated. The New Left was a synthetic creation that was very much created to push communism out of intellectual circles, to kind of nudge people who might become sympathetic to the communists and to the Soviet Union, to China, and nudge them in another direction. The question is here. Is it true that MLK Jr. was killed because he started to realize the problem was class struggle, not just race? I will count that as your question, even though it wasn't included in the super chat. He was killed because he started to realize that class was the main question. So there we go. And thank you very much, Small Town Voice, Sophia. So there we go. And that is on the list. So yes, McCarthyism was accusing anything the Democrats do of being communist. And during the Cold War, it was true the Democrats were the party that was more willing to negotiate, more willing to de-escalate the arms race. Now that is not the case. Now the Democrats are the more pro-war party. The Democrats are the more authoritarian party. The Republicans are the party that's more bigoted, you could say, that is promoting more anti-immigrant sentiment, that promotes, more kind of settler hostility, the gun culture, etc. But the Democrats are very much the party of the authoritarian state at this time. The Republicans are the party of the lower levels of capital and the working class in opposition to the low-wage police state and its wars. And the Republican Party is full of war hawks. It's full of brutal authoritarians. The Restrict Act. I mean, the Republican Party is no good. I'm not endorsing the Republican Party, but the Republican Party is where Americans that have anti-establishment sentiments go. I mean, so there you go. All right. The next super chat I have is I support Tara Reade. She's a brave anti-imperialist, and I support Tara Reade as well. Tara Reade is an amazing person, and it is an honor every moment I've got to spend with her, whether in person at CPI conferences. She spoke at our CPI conference in Chicago last year, whether it was that or whether it was, in online interactions that we've had. I think I do want to just show just because of the circumstances. Why don't we show, if I can find it here, why don't we show Tara Reade at the CPI conference? If I can pull that video up, Yeah, here we go. I'll just pull that up. I'll show you when we gave Tara Reade an award at our conference, because it was just a really beautiful moment. It was really one of the best moments. It was really just a beautiful moment when we gave Tara Reade an award at our CPI conference. So I'm going to show that clip right now, just because I want people to see it in light of the fact that she's now in exile. I mean, when I heard that she was in exile, I mean, that was when I heard she wasn't coming back from Russia. That was big, and my heart goes out to her and her family and what they must be feeling right now. And I mean, wow, she thought she was coming to Russia for a month, and then Matt Gaetz told her not to come home. I mean, watch her press conference. I'm not her spokesperson. I don't represent her. Watch her words about it. I don't want to say the wrong thing and misrepresent her position. Tara Reade is an amazing human being, an amazing, brave anti-imperialist, a victim of Joe Biden's vicious brutality. And it's really awful. So I'm just going to pull up this video from our Chicago conference. I'm going to show the whole thing. I'll show you our opening ceremony that we did. And I'll also show you the Uhuru movement. And then I'll show you when we gave an award. We gave an award to Tara Reade. We presented her with an award at our conference because she is a great, heroic anti-imperialist voice. It's really just an honor to interact with her in every way and to see what they're doing to her now. I mean, it's just horrifying. I mean, what this woman has been through. You want to talk about a heroic, brave person. That's what Tara Reade is. And the fact that she's now in exile, I mean, that is just, she's been forced to flee her home country. I mean, she can't live in America anymore. That is criminal. It's absolutely criminal what they've done to her. That Matt Gaetz, a member of Congress, told her she wasn't safe to come home. This is just a quick review of the big moments from our Chicago conference, that we did at the end of June last year. So here you go. You'll see our flag ceremony. You'll see us honor the Uhuru movement, and then you'll see us give an award to Tara Reade.
organization here today to show that we are not afraid, we are not intimidated, and that we offer nothing but unequivocal full support and solidarity to them while they're under attack. Please stand up.
The Uhuru movement.
Labeling black revolutionaries and civil rights activists as agents of Russia is one of the dirtiest tricks of the U.S. deep state. They called Martin Luther King Jr. a Soviet agent. They called the Nation of Islam foreign agents. And we are here today to say that black people have the right to organize, fight for their rights however they choose, and that the U.S. government has no right to call them Russian agents or repress them in any way. The FBI raids must now stop. Must stop immediately now. Stop the raids. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Columbayi Antoinette, and how I always start any speech that I ever do is with a chant. So I want to teach you, or maybe you already know it, join in, because this is just the meditation of my heart, even coming here, and why it would never be any kind of retreat. We would never surrender. We would never compromise. We will continue to move forward and build. Fist up, fight back. Fist up, fight back. Fist up,
Fight back!
fist up,
Fight back!
fist up.
Fight back!
This is what fight back look like.
We have here, before you go down, before you sit down, I want to present to you the International Solidarity and Truth Award. This is the Center for Political Innovations Award we are giving to Tara Reade for actions in defense of international truth and solidarity in the pursuit of peace and justice.
Thank you so much. I feel warmth and connection with community, and it reminds me of when I was a child with my mom with the Progressive Labor Party and the Committee Against Racism. I love the unity, and I am with you. I wanted to dedicate this to the Uhuru movement. I want to dedicate this to them. Dedicate this to the investigative reporters right now in Donbass that are facing Patrick Lancaster, Ava Bartlett, right? Alina Litt, Wyatt Reade. They're putting their lives and their livelihoods on the line to tell the truth. So while I'm here safe in this building with you, right now they're running from bombs and trying to get us the truth, and we've got to keep lifting them up. So thank you. And solidarity.
Solidarity. We love you. And I'll just take this opportunity to say, you know what? The Uhuru movement got their homes raided by the FBI. And a week later, we were platforming them at our conference and rallying people in Chicago to support them. And Tara Reade heroically stood against the President of the United States, exposing him as a sexual predator, as a criminal, and standing against his pro-imperialist lies as well. And we platformed her at the CPI conference. Name one other communist group in the United States that is doing what we are doing. We were with Tara Reade. We were with the Uhuru movement. The Uhuru movement has personally and directly thanked the Center for Political Innovation for our heroic work. We have stood with the Uhuru movement like nobody else. We're standing with Tara Reade. You know, she spoke at our conference. You know, I mean, she's in touch with me. You know, we've talked on the phone many times. We are in the vanguard politically. I mean, we are doing, is the Communist Party doing anything like what we do? Is the Revolutionary Communist Party, is the, you know, is the Workers' World Party, the PSL, or any of them doing anything like what we're doing right now? No. right? You know, and that is why we've been so viciously attacked. Is because this is just common sense. If William Z. Foster was alive today and running the Communist Party would be supporting the Uhuru movement, and the Communist Party would be giving a platform to Tara Reade. But William Z. Foster isn't running the Communist Party. Instead, it's run by Joe Sims, and so they're not doing that. You know, and, you know, I mean, we are doing what any communist would do in this situation as the country faces the danger of a low-wage police state, when black revolutionaries are being accused of being Russian agents and indicted by the federal government, when, you know, when a heroic woman is being driven out of the country because the president is leading the war charge against Russia, sexually assaulted her and wants to cover her up and silence her, you know, we are the ones. We are in the vanguard. No other organization is doing what CPI is doing. And I guess I'll just say this now. I was going to say this earlier. I didn't think it was appropriate. I'll say it now, right? I think it's appropriate now. They tried to cancel that conference you just watched, right? They tried to cancel that conference. I was called on the phone, and I think you all know who it was by. I think you can all guess who the individual was. I'm not going to say who, but he knows he did it, and he called me on the phone. And I said to him, you know, I said to him, what's the deal? Like, what's going on here? And he said to me, you're going to cancel the conference, aren't you? And I said, no, I'm not going to cancel the conference. And he said, but, you know, we're going to cancel the conference. They tried to blackmail me into canceling that conference where we platformed the Uhuru movement and we platformed Tara Reade. And they tried to blackmail me into canceling the conference. That's basically what they did. They didn't say, we're not going to go after you if you don't, but there was every effort made directly by the main person who was involved in the attack on me, said to me directly on the phone twice, you're going to cancel the conference, right? And I said, no. And I did that conference anyway, right? So, you know, and I warned you all in the speech. I warned you that they were coming for us. In my speech, I told you they were coming at me. So, you know, look at what we're doing. Is any communist group doing anything? There should be huge marches in Washington, D.C. Hundreds of thousands of people should be demanding hands off Uhuru, hands off Tara Reade. But no one else is doing it, and we're doing it. So, you know, if you have any doubt about why I've been so viciously targeted, look at that video again and look at what's happened since then. Look at how Tara Reade has been forced into exile. Look at how Uhuru's now been indicted. It wasn't enough to just raid their homes and terrorize them. They've been indicted. If you have any doubt about why we have been so viciously targeted as an organization, and I personally have been subject to so many attacks, just review what we did in Chicago and what happened at our conference. You know, just review it, right? I mean, we are in the vanguard, folks. We are at the center of the struggle against imperialism. We're with Tara Reade. We're with the Uhuru movement. We are with Rage Against the War Machine, that amazing anti-war rally. We are with the people. We are with the people. We are with the struggle against the imperialists. All right, next question. And this is an interesting one. Are Maoists, Christian asks, just people who like the Cultural Revolution? Well, you'll notice that Maoist is not a term that was ever used by the Chinese Communist Party. And still to this day, they don't use the term. The Chinese Communist Party says it has Marxist-Leninist ideology and it has Mao Zedong thought. And that's the term that was used, Mao Zedong thought. And then on top of that, it has Deng Xiaoping theory, right? Marxist-Leninist ideology, Mao Zedong thought, and Deng Xiaoping theory. Right? It wasn't, the term Maoist was used to describe people who aligned with the Chinese Communist Party. But it was not ever a term they used to describe themselves, right? The Communist Party USA would refer to Progressive Labor Party, the Revolutionary Youth Movement. They would refer to them as Maoists, but they never called themselves Maoists. They called themselves Marxist-Leninists. They talked about Mao Zedong thought. They talked about anti-revisionism. They would say, you know, they would often, they would say, you know, we're Marxist-Leninists, or, you know, they would be the Communist Party, parenthesis, Marxist-Leninists, something like that. The term, you didn't have anyone calling themselves Maoists until the 1980s. In the 1980s, there was a meeting that was held, and a number of parties that had cut off their relationship with China, right, that had declared that the Chinese Communist Party was no good, that the Chinese Communist Party had restored capitalism. They had a meeting, I believe it was in London, and they called themselves the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement, or the RIM. And it was the Communist Party of Peru, the Shining Path. It was the Naxalites in India. It was the RCP, the Bobavakian people in the United States, and it was, it was a couple groups in different parts of the world. They had a meeting, and they declared themselves to be MLM, Marxist Leninist Maoists. And that is not ever anything the Chinese Communist Party has ever promoted. And that is not that. I maintain that stuff, Shining Path, Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, MLM, I maintain that is a deviation, because what those people promote, they do not talk about economics ever. There's nothing about economics. It's just the government is bad, the state is bad, and we're going to get guns together and take over. It's Blanquism. Louis Auguste Blanqui was a revolutionary figure during Marx's lifetime who didn't believe in economics, just wanted to carry out a military seizure of power. He rejected the notion of class struggle and just focused on coups, having a military coup. And I maintain that MLM, Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, the Shining Path in Peru, the Naxals in India, that these folks, they are more or less, they are Blanquists. Now, you'll notice that in Nepal, right, the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, that's one party that was from this trend, right? They denounced China, they engaged in guerrilla warfare, but then they won, right? The king of Nepal was forced to step down. They entered the government, and now they have merged with the other communist parties in Nepal, and they have become friendly with China again, and they've established relations with China, and they've dropped the MLM stuff, right? Which is interesting. In Nepal, there was a party that waged guerrilla warfare in the countryside that was from the MLM school of things, but they actually won. And when they won, they realized, oh, shit, we can't act like a bunch of crazy ultra-leftists. And now the Communist Party of Nepal, they've merged with the other communist parties in Nepal, and they're involved with China. They're building railway through Nepal, and they're a very good party. I think that they are now part of the ruling coalition, Prachanda, et cetera. That's one example of a party that comes out of that school of thinking, kind of politically maturing in the process of struggle. They joined the 7-party alliance. Now they've merged with the other communist parties. But MLM, what you call MLM, or Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, is an ultra-leftist ideology. And that's Paul Moron, the Irish guy who thinks I'm racist because I wave the American flag. Paul Moron, and people on the internet who worship the Shining Path, and think all Republicans are Nazis, and talk about the trans issue nonstop, and talk about blood and violence, and are always glorifying killing and violence, and never talk about economics. It's a big thing on the internet. A lot of teenagers get into that. They think that's communism, but it's really an insult to Mao's politics, because Mao Zedong was a brilliant political organizer, and these people, all they like him for is because he had a gun. They like that Mao had a gun, that he waged guerrilla warfare. They don't understand that Mao was so much more than that. Mao was a brilliant statesman. He entered alliances. He understood the soul of the Chinese people. These people have never heard of the Taiping uprising, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, and the civil war that happened in China in the 1860s. That was a huge, probably a bigger impact on Mao spiritually and politically than Marxism was. The Taiping uprising, that was a Christian utopian socialist rebellion that rocked China in the 1860s. They've never heard of it. They don't understand what Mao was saying in his report on the Hunan province. They don't understand. They just see Mao in this one-dimensional way, as a guy who had a gun and was ultra-revolutionary, and they don't understand it. And that conference created many strong alliances that still endure today and probably wouldn't have existed otherwise. That is absolutely right. Tara Reade was working as a producer for Kim Iverson. She got Chairman O'Malley on Kim Iverson's show. And and it wasn't just that. There were other alliances that were made. That conference, that was a really historic conference. And there's a reason the government, I think it was the government, but it was powerful forces regardless. A lot of forces tried to prevent that conference from happening. And you don't even know the half of it. It wasn't just phone calls. Phone calls were made to other people too. There was a huge effort by unnamed forces to prevent that August conference from happening. They pulled out all the stops to make that conference from happening, and we did it anyway. And we still did that conference, and we did it under a lot of threat and a lot of pressure. And it was a great step forward. And the Chicago people who were there, shout out to all of you. You guys were amazing. After it was all over, they gave me this beautiful, beautiful thing. I'm going to get it down. The Chicago people, after that conference, they approached me and they gave this to me. It was so beautiful. It was just such a beautiful gift. They gave this to me because they knew I was a Christian and they knew that I was a communist. And so they saw that they made this for me and they gave it to me as a gift. It was one of the most sweetest gifts. It's probably the sweetest gift I've ever received in my life. No one has ever given me a gift like this before. A gift that says, I understand what you're about, Caleb, and I respect it and I admire it. I got this gift. This gift was given to me after the Chicago conference. I was so moved. I just burst into tears when I was given this gift by Comrade Sam from Chicago, who came to town. He was coming into town for a meeting in New Jersey, and he stopped by my apartment a couple of weeks after the conference, and he gave this to me. It was one of the most beautiful gifts I've ever received. It is sitting on my shelf here. It's gotten through many, many tough days. I look at this and I think about how amazing it was that a group of people would do something so kind for me, to make something like this, to support me in a time like that. It's just so amazing. And this is the most beautiful gift I have ever received. It is one of my most treasured items that I've ever received. And, shout out to all the Chicago people. Gabby, I know you were there holding the Z. That was you holding the Z. Shout out to you, Gabby, and shout out to everyone in Chicago, who was there, Ellie and Olympia Logic and, everybody who was there. Shout out to all of you. It was, and Christian was there and other people from around the country. That conference, it's weird. It wasn't huge. There was about, I would say 75 people there. Some people said maybe 85 at one point. It wasn't huge, but it was a shot heard around the world. I mean, look what has happened in the aftermath of it. Look what has happened in the aftermath of it. I mean, it was a shot heard around the world. That conference, and you'll notice Newsweek ran an article about that conference. Newsweek did a story on that conference. Do you remember this? Newsweek magazine was so shaken up by our conference that we did last August. They did a fucking story about it. Like, that's how big of a deal that conference was. Right? And now Tara Reade is in exile and the Uhuru movement is indicted. And I mean, it's just, you think about that conference, and we are living in historical times. We are living in a historical moment. If you're part of the CPI, you're in the game. You know what I'm saying? You can just sit there on the internet and call yourself a communist all day long. You can just sit there on the internet and call yourself a communist. You can just sit there, and have a meeting with a bunch of people and read Marx books and think you're smarter than everybody else. But if you're part of CPI, you're in the game for real. Look, the fact that conference, it only had 75, 85 people there, but Newsweek ran a story on it. And now everything that's happened, the government tried to stop it with every intimidation method possible. And now we see that Tara Reade is in exile and Uhuru is indicted. I mean, if you were at that conference, that conference being there, that was like, that was kind of like, I mean, I don't want to say the wrong thing here, but like that being at that conference was like, it was like maybe, being at an event where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke or Malcolm X spoke. Being at that conference was like maybe like, going to a meeting of the committees of correspondence in the lead up to the American Revolution. Like, you were in a room that was at the center of the action. I'm not saying myself was equivalent of any of that. I'm not saying that, but it's like you were in a room that was at the center of the action. If you went to a meeting of the committees of correspondence in 1774 or 1773, you were at the center of the action because in a few years there was going to be the American Revolution. If you went to a meeting where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke, you were at the center of a really important historical moment called the Civil Rights Movement, and if you were at that conference in Chicago, think about it. Think about where you were. You were in the same room as Tara Reade. You were in the same room as the Uhuru movement a week after they raided their homes. You were, think about it. You were like You want to talk about, like you were in the set, like that was, you were in a historical moment right there. You that was like going to a meeting of the Bolsheviks in 1905 or 1903 or something like that, right? Like you were attached to big historical events, Tara Reade, the Uhuru movement. And people are going to be remembering the times we're living in. I don't want to over exaggerate these things, right? I'm sure there's people going to make fun of me for this. Oh my God, that's cringe. Well, it's not cringe, right? And the fact that Newsweek ran a story on that conference, the fact that the Uhuru movement and everything that's gone on with them, we were in the center of that struggle. From the beginning, we've been in the center of that struggle. And now Tara Reade has been forced out of the country. We're in the center of that struggle. And I mean, you were in that room, you are going to be bragging to your grandchildren that you were in that room. I'm just telling you. Someday you're going to say, you're going to be watching, the History Channel 2 generations from now, and there's going to be specials about this time in American history, and you're going to pause the TV and you're going to say, grandkids, I was in that room. They're going to show that clip, and they're going to passingly mention the Uhuru movement and Tara Reade. You're going to pause it and you're going to say to your grandkids, I was in that room. That's what you're going to say, because by being in that room, by being one of the few, it was less than 100 people there, you were in a historical moment. And it was historical that Newsweek thought it was important. It was historical that powerful people were blackmailing me basically and trying to get me to cancel the conference. You were in a historical moment if you were there. And CPI, again, we platformed Scott Ritter. We had a conference, the Summit Against Hypocrisy in Washington, D.C. We're not a huge group of people, but we are in the struggle. We are where it counts. We are where it counts, right? And sometimes it kind of makes me, well, I don't know. That's a whole rant I could go on. We got plenty more super chats to answer. But what was the one that just went by? Have you seen Norman Finkelstein's Weather Maoism panel? I have not, but you've seen Norman Finkelstein's Weather Maoism panel. All right. Wrote it down. My grandfather died fighting in the Korean War. What approach should be used when discussing this with my family? Well, you know what approach I would use when discussing that with your family? I would talk about how important, or not how important, but how horrifying that war really was. Don't talk about who was good and who was bad. When you're talking about that with your family, I would go and read Bruce Cummings and his writings, go and watch The Unknown War, the BBC documentary about the Korean War, and I would just share with your family, this is what Grandpa was going through. This is where Grandpa was, because the details of the Korean War are not pretty. You have no idea the Korean War. The Korean War was a really horrendous war. It's like you're talking 2 to 4 million people killed. And it was a really devastating, horrendous war. And the reality of that war and what went on and the atrocities that were committed and the death and the suffering and the threats of nuclear involvement. No one knows anything about the Korean War except that, North Korea invaded South Korea, which is like, that doesn't even make any sense, because at that point, Korea was one country. It's still one country. And, there were 2 governments on the Korean Peninsula, and then the government in the South started slaughtering the people who sympathized with the North. And so then, we don't really know who fired the first shot, but the North, it basically felt they had to protect their country folk in the South. And, regardless, focus on the actual details of that war and how horrendous it was and what the Korean people have been through, and focus on the need for reconciliation. I would avoid trying to refight the politics of the Korean War. If you ask me, right, all North Korea has ever asked for is one government for the whole peninsula where every party can participate. That's all they've ever asked for. Let the Korean Workers' Party, the Communist Party, participate and be part of the government, along with the other parties. That's all they've ever asked for. One government where every party can participate. That was the agreement after World War II, was that, there were two temporary governments that were formed, but the idea was eventually they'd have elections for the whole peninsula where every party could participate. And then Sigmund Reade became the military dictator in the South, and he said, nope, no communists. Korean Workers' Party, not allowed. That's the basis. That's why this whole conflict started, is the USA would not allow a coalition government to be formed. The communists in North Korea, they didn't want to have a separate government. They just wanted to be part of the coalition government for the whole peninsula, and the United States wouldn't allow it, right? But again, you're going to have a hard time convincing your relatives of that. That might be the next step, right? But I think the first step is to just talk to your relatives about how awful that war was, and since your grandfather died in that war, they're going to be interested, and just talk about the unknown horrors of that war, right? That would be the first thing. And then gradually you can start to bring up Sigmund Reade and the military dictatorship in the South. Gradually you can bring up that the communists just wanted to be part of the coalition government, and gradually you can get them to understand how that war was forced to occur, and basically you can kind of get them to understand that, it's not to say that North Korea and those forces didn't do bad things during the war. I'm sure they committed atrocities too, but basically a country was prevented from allowing all the people to be part of the new government. It was forcibly divided by U.S. imperialism. And that comes across. So there we go. Was Marcus Garvey a city builder? Absolutely. I support all black nationalism, and I look up to Marcus Garvey. I mean, the father of American black nationalism, a very charismatic, dynamic individual. I look up to him. I do know that he did, he really did not like Marxists. He felt that Marxists, he liked the Soviet Union, which is interesting because the Soviet Union supported the colonized people of the world. And he liked Lenin and the Soviet Union, but he hated the American communists. He felt that the American communists were trying to co-opt the black struggle and use it for their own reasons. And I know that when he was on trial, he did go on a rant against the Jews in court. I mean, he did, he argued that there was some kind of Jewish conspiracy against him. And that there was a feeling among a lot of black nationalists, even back then, they felt that the NAACP there were a lot of white people in it who were manipulating the NAACP and using it for their own purposes. And, Marcus Garvey, the NAACP was the main, black activist group that advocated racial integration. And Marcus Garvey and the Back to Africa movement, they were separatists. They wanted, they said, black people would never be equal in America. So they wanted to go back to Africa. They wanted to, have their own kind of, their own society. They were separatists. And that there was a feeling on Marcus Garvey's part that the NAACP had been set up by white people. And I think he also specifically named the Jews. He argued that it was Jewish white people, and the Jews are discriminated against also for being Jewish, and that they were using black people. That was his feeling, which that's kind of an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, one could argue. So he made that argument. But I view him, despite, having said various things, and despite having, he was really a believer in black capitalism, and he was very opposed to socialism. He thought socialism, again, was a white man's conspiracy theory to use black people for his own ends, and so, I obviously don't agree with that, but Marcus Garvey was a leader of black people who organized black people to fight for their rights, to build up their own communities. Anyone who's anti-imperialist has to support that. You support all nationalism of the oppressed, right? And so black people and oppressed, colonized people in America, they're organizing for their rights. You got to support them. And so Marcus Garvey, I listen to his speeches. I get very inspired. I mean, he's an amazing, dynamic speaker and organizer. He was deported from the United States to Jamaica. I mean, you have to admire a leader of black people in the 1920s, right? I mean, the civil rights movement and stuff like that wasn't until the 50s, right? This is back in the 1920s, in the age of Jim Crow and all of that. And he was very persecuted. He identified black people in their struggle with the global struggle of resistance against imperialism. And he liked the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union backed anybody. It would back any force around the world that was fighting against imperialism. So he liked the Soviet Union. So it's complicated, right? And honestly, the communists, they probably didn't treat him right. They may have, kind of mobilized, their allies in the black community to move against him in a sectarian way, which wouldn't have been the correct thing to do. So it's a complicated position. So there you go. All right. Is there any CPI literature I could promote or hand out at my local strip mall to grow efforts in the area? Absolutely, there is. We now have these amazing CPI business cards that were made by Timoshenko, and you can hand these out. We also have a number of books, and actually, we're working on some very nice palm cards with the 4-point plan on them. Elizabeth Young, our president, just drew up some and sent them to me. It was really beautiful. So yes, the answer is yes, but you got to join the CPI. You got to become a member, and we can ship them to you, Molly. So if you're not already a member of the CPI, go and join the CPI, and we will ship you some of that literature. We'll make sure you can do that. And I would encourage you to come on our Zoom calls and describe the outreach. We are trying to develop a culture of outreach in our organization, because right now we talk to each other. That's not enough. We need to get out of the movement to the masses. We're developing the weekend workshops as a mechanism for bringing new members into the organization. We are working on making CPI a recruitment machine. Right now, CPI is people like all of you who went looking for this or found out about this one way or another. You are a member. Very good. Well, email the Solidarity list and we'll connect you, Molly. Just send an email to Solidarity or member requests. Just send us an email and we'll make it happen, Molly. Or you can email me directly if you have problems. You can email me first name, last name @gmail.com. No spaces, periods, or anything. CalebMaupin @gmail.com. Email me, and between me and the official CPI Solidarity, we'll get you what you need. I'm really glad you want to do outreach. We are trying to transform CPI into an outreach-oriented organization right now, and that's difficult because right now it's mainly people like you all who are great, who just found us online. But we want to make it so that people who wouldn't go looking for CPI, people who wouldn't go looking for this organization, come and find out what we're about. And that's what the workshop that we're doing in Missouri at the end of the month, that's going to be largely focused on. How do we become a recruitment-oriented organization? How do we win new people to our organization? How do we take out of the movement to the masses to heart? And so, I would encourage you, Molly, if possible, I would encourage you to also come to the weekend workshop that we're doing at the end of June, where we're going to discuss these things. We are going to transform ourselves in the next few months into an outreach and recruitment-oriented organization. Right now, we are too insular in our focus, and we need to become an outreach-oriented organization. Next question. This is from Sophia in Virginia. Was it true that Martin Luther King Jr. was killed because he started to realize that class was the main question, not just race? Yes, I would argue that is more or less the case. He was killed in April of 1968, and he was killed when he went to Memphis, Tennessee, because the sanitation workers of the city were on strike. They were on strike, and their slogan was, "I am a man," right? And they were marching, demanding better treatment from the city of Memphis. That they got treated badly, they got low wages, etc. And they were the sanitation workers. They were the people who kept the city clean. And they were mistreated. And so because of that, they were on strike, and Martin Luther King went down there to support them, and he was killed at his hotel. I always tell people Martin Luther King Jr. was shot down on a picket line. I mean, he wasn't literally on the picket line when he was shot, but he was in Memphis to support a strike. So he was shot down in a working class struggle. He had started the Poor People's Campaign, which eventually occupied Washington, D.C., even after his death, to demand economic justice. And he was focusing on economic justice. The last book that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. ever wrote was called Where Do We Go From Here? And the book advocated a guaranteed minimum income for all citizens, and it said that capitalism was the problem. Martin Luther King Jr. was becoming a social democrat. He was friends with Michael Harrington, who's the individual who eventually started the Democratic Socialists of America. He was becoming friendly with the State Department Socialists and with the DSA, kind of the people who eventually started DSA. At that point, they were still in the Socialist Party, a lot of them, but they were involved in the Lyndon Johnson administration. Many of them worked for the administration of Lyndon Johnson as like policy advisors on poverty programs, and people called them the State Department Socialists because they weren't really anti-imperialist, but they were really into, the labor unions and the welfare state. And they worked kind of within the Democratic Party. And you are absolutely right. A true American hero, even not being a communist. Absolutely. And he was becoming friendly with them. And then he gave his famous Beyond Vietnam speech, which is a very revolutionary speech, basically supporting the Vietnamese people against the U.S. imperialists. And then he was killed. And so, yes, Martin Luther King Jr. was drifting in a much more revolutionary and anti-capitalist direction. It's also important to note that he was quite unpopular at the time of his death. The height of his career was like 1961, 1959. But, you know, in his final years, the NAACP condemned him. He was considered to be too radical, too far left. At the time of his death, he was quite unpopular. You know, the black community still rioted all over the country in response to his death. The country went up in flames, but he had become less and less popular with the American public. Michael Moore tells the story of, you know, in Michigan, he was at church one night and somebody, it was a late night church service that he was at, and somebody in the parking lot was heating up their car because it was a little cold outside. And as people were walking out of the church, someone shouted, you know, they'd heard on their car radio, they just shot Martin Luther King. And the crowd coming out of the church applauded. They thought it was a good thing that Martin Luther King Jr. had been killed. Michael Moore talks about that in one of his books, that was a moment he'll never forget. He felt so horrified that he was with a crowd of people that were cheering that Martin Luther King Jr. had been killed, because a lot of, you know, conservative Americans didn't like the civil rights movement, thought Martin Luther King was a radical, and that as he was walking out of this church in Michigan with other working class people in Michigan, you know, someone shouted, they just shot Martin Luther King, and people applauded. It's horrifying thing. So, you know, that was, you know, April of 1968. That's when Columbia University was seized. The students at Columbia University rose up. And that's, you know, that was a pivotal moment. 1968 was kind of the climax. 68, 69 was kind of the climax of the transition between the early Cold War and the late Cold War, and the dramatic cultural shifts that happened in U.S. society during those times. So there you go. Have you seen Norman Finkelstein's Wither Maoism panel? I have not seen this panel. I haven't seen it. I know that it happened. It was done by the Platypus Affiliated Society, and I guess I can watch it. I kind of worry about, I'm interested in it. I probably should just listen to it. I haven't, part of me, I don't know. I'll just go listen to it and see what he has to say. I'll go listen to it and I'll get back to you on that. Maybe we'll react to it on this stream. Maybe not, though. I'd like to meet with Norman Finkelstein. He lives in New York City, around the same place I live, from what I understand. I'd like to interact with him, talk to him. I really like his anti-woke book. It's up there on my shelf. It's a great book. So there we go, folks. All right, folks. I'll be back tomorrow night. Talk to you soon. Yeah, we'll be back. Upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.